Okay, our next speaker is Sarah Light. She's going to be speaking about cover crops and weed management and some considerations. Okay, Sarah, whenever you're ready.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Sarah Light. I'm an Agronomy Farm Advisor based in Yuba City. I serve Sutter-Yuba and Colusa counties. And as Whitney said, I'm going to be talking about cover crops and weed management. I'm also going to be sharing just a few slides about an alfalfa weed management trial that I finished last year. So cover crops are planted into ground that's otherwise fallow. So in an annual system, they're usually planted in the winter if you're growing summer annuals, or some people grow summer cover crops following something that they've harvested early, like wheat, or sometimes people have had like an early tomato harvest and they plant a summer cover crop. But typically in an annual system, they're grown in ground that's otherwise fallow. So a fallow field, in a perennial system, they can be planted in between tree rows or vines, etc. So cover crops can outcompete weeds, but only weeds that grow in the same season. So sometimes I think there's an idea that we can use cover crops to suppress summer weeds, a cover crop that we would grow in the winter, but a cover crop works by outcompeting our weeds for resources like the sun, nutrients in the soil, closing the canopy and shading those out from germinating or thriving. And so it's a really important consideration if you're using cover crops for weed management to consider what weeds you're trying to control in what season, and making a selection accordingly. Cover crops do have to be established well to be competitive, and this can be hard in a drought. I'm going to show some data from various research projects on weed suppression using cover crops, and some of those were during different rain years. And so really to be the most competitive, cover crops like our cash crops really need to close canopy rapidly, and then weeds have less of a chance. So if you can plant your cover crops a little bit earlier so you can take advantage of those first fall rains, that's always a benefit. If you have an opportunity to irrigate your cover crop, that will allow it to be much more competitive, and I'll show some data from a couple of sites like that too. However, with the drought and water shortages, this is really a difficult decision. And then just wanted to point out that some of the benefits of cover cropping, like water infiltration, reduced runoff, and increased organic matter, can be achieved with what people refer to as residual vegetation, and that just is a kind word, a kind term for uncontrolled weeds. So basically having any living material in place can have some of those kind of soil health benefits. But then of course you have a lot of weeds in your field. So the advantage with the cover crop is that you've selected what you're growing, you're not letting your weeds to grow in abundance, and then you also might be achieving some other benefits if that's your goal. So with regards to weed suppression, these are pictures from 2 years of the same trial where we did 2 rates of vetch compared to a fallow control. And we took a lot of soil health measurements as well as greenhouse gas measurements. And Amber Vinkasey-Vall, the Veg Crop Advisor in my area, and I put together a project summary that you can find on my cooperative extension website. And the graduate student we've been working with is summarizing some of the greenhouse gas data now. But with regards to weeds, on the right is 1 year when there was no volunteer wheat in the field, and on the left is the year when there was volunteer wheat. And so the vetch on the right is growing just with kind of weeds from the field, and on the left is growing almost in a mix with the volunteer wheat. And we can see some of these differences. This is a quadrant, a meter by meter squared quadrant that we would use to measure this. So the results from the seeding rate, on the left, this is the 2018 year, and on the right is 2019. So 2018 was a much wetter winter, about 16 inches of rain, and this was the year when the volunteer wheat came up very rapidly. It actually made a really nice mixed stand though between wheat and vetch, and we can see the control plot had volunteer wheat, weeds, and bare soil, but of course no cover crop. The reason that bare soil is problematic is because one of the big tenements of soil health is maintaining soil coverage or soil armor to protect our soil from things like erosion, from surface compaction when we get heavy rains, etc. So we want to see that. We want to see the weeds shrink and also the bare soil shrink, ideally. Below that, we're looking at purple vetch and 2 seeding rates. We had an issue with the planter and we overseeded the plots the first year. And so we planted at 70 and 140 pounds of vetch per acre. There really wasn't a huge advantage in terms of soil coverage or weed suppression with that higher seeding rate. We considered the wheat to be kind of not the cover crop, but kind of an additional benefit because it wasn't a weed going to seed and it wasn't bare soil. So you can see that the green and purple combine here are very similar in size. And then similar, if you go to the right side, this is 2019, which was a much drier year, only 6 inches of rain for the season, but almost 5 inches of those were in November and December, which gave that cover crop a competitive advantage, getting out the door, getting kind of a robust start. And that's a big difference from the data I'll show next from last year, when it was just a little bit more than an inch before the end of the year, and the cover crops really didn't have a chance to kind of hit the ground running. But this 2019 data, we're seeing again, this gray is the vetch, and they're very similar in size with both seeding rates as compared to weeders and bare soil. In my opinion, there isn't a huge advantage to spending a ton more money, especially on expensive legume seed, if you're trying to do this weed suppression. And please look at the project summary, because actually the benefits we saw between the two seeding rates with regards to nitrogen and some of the other metrics we measured were not there either. So I think if you're wanting to plant a lower seeding rate, that's generally going to be fine, but trying that out in your own system, of course, is always a great practice. The last picture from this I'll show is from March 18th here, and then April 11th. This is the year with the volunteer wheat, and we can see this vetch just trellised up super fast in 3 weeks. Not only did both outcompete weeds, but when we did a measurement from 3 weeks later of total C and total nitrogen and total carbon, we found that total nitrogen increased by a factor of 4 in those 3 weeks, and total carbon by almost a factor of 5. So huge benefit to letting your cover crop growing later with regards to some other soil health benefits, although maybe not for weeds. One grower has estimated to me, when they spray their winter weeds to maintain a chemical fallow in the winter, they spray twice usually, and they've estimated up to a $65 per acre savings between materials, gas, and labor from having a cover crop that is robust. Now, though, moving forward to some data from last year, and I'm going to show kind of data from 2 different fields from last year. One has vetch and vetch plus cereal rye, and one has a mustard, triticale, and then safflower. So they're not all side by side in the same field, but they're just about 10 miles apart. And I think they give an interesting story of how variety selection can play an important role in outcompeting with our weeds. So in this treatment, this is purple vetch at 50 pounds an acre. Both of these trials are replicated 3 times. And again, in this year, we only got a little bit over an inch of water before the end of the year. Legumes are are not as competitive with weeds in general. They are a little more sensitive also to water stress and wet feet both. So they can be a little bit harder to establish when conditions are not optimum. And so here, if we look at this picture on the left, all that kind of shiny dark red is actually stinging nettle for the most part. And then this close-up picture, we see here a lot of nettle leaves. So there was still a good amount of vetch, but the weeds did get pretty competitive. And looking at this pie chart, this was collected on the 24th, end of February. And so the weeds are over half of it, and the cover crop is about 45% as compared to the bare soil. And then when we look at the purple vetch and cereal rye, also seeded at 50 pounds per acre of that mix, similarly, the cover crop did not get a chance to really establish well. In fact, the bare soil percentage was higher as an average between these plots. And this and the purple vetch plots were chemically terminated on the 2nd of March prior to planting sunflowers. Well, then they incorporated it and then planted sunflowers. And compared to the fallow control, so this would be more of a standard grower practice to spray out the plots to maintain a chemical fallow. In addition, this data, the main data being collected in this project is looking at water dynamics. And so we wanted to maintain a plantless field to compare how water dynamics change with and without a cover crop as compared to a fallow field. And we can see here, though, that the chemical spray was effective. The majority of the plots are bare, and then we have a sliver of weeds. But here are moisture sensors that we have in that field. Then one interesting thing that happened, I like to kind of share the good and the bad when I'm talking about cover crops, because I think it's important as we're making these decisions. So in addition to that cost savings that you can achieve if you get a nice, robust cover crop stand that outcompetes your weeds, a potential challenge and downfall that I observed in this year when it was very dry and the vetch really did just not do well. They didn't irrigate it, they didn't have water to irrigate it, and the rain just didn't come. So when they planted the sunflowers at the end of March, then they had to actually go back and hand weed. There's not a lot of good broadleaf post-emergent herbicides for sunflower, and so they had a really bad mallow in the field. And the grower called me and was like, "I'm just noticing we had hand weeders, a team come in, and I'm seeing pretty big differences, I think, by plot." So I went out there and did some just quick mallow counts of the mallow that was left in the furrow by the weeding crew in each plot, and I found actually that there was huge differences between the cover crop plots because they hadn't had that chemical application in early February like the fallow had. So when you have a robust cover crop and it can outcompete weeds, that's effective and will save you money. However, if it's maybe worth the money to establish a robust cover crop if you have the option to do so, because you may be left with a situation like this where the weeds can be harder to control later on. However, another field just about 10 miles down the road, we didn't plant any legumes here. We did triticale at 100 pounds an acre in one of our plots. Again, a little over 1 inch of water by the end of the year, very little precipitation. And this triticale did just fine. We see a little bit of mustard pressure here in the plots, but this is actually just where it's come out of the hopper after planting. Mustard is one of our treatments here, so that kind of just popped up. And then the triticale cover crop was the vast majority of the plot as compared to the weeds in the bare soil. So really did a nice job of closing canopy and being competitive. Some growers who furrow irrigate have complained to me about triticale making a really big root ball, and that when they incorporate it, that can kind of muck up their furrows. So again, when selecting variety, it's just important to know the opportunities in your system and the challenges to make the best choice. I also did safflower as a treatment. This is the safflower plots. We can see there is a lot of bare soil as well as weed pressure in the safflower plots. Again, this blue is the safflower, the green is bare soil, and the red is weeds. So the majority of that plot was not the cover crop, unfortunately. Why did I select safflower that is a summer annual as a winter cover crop trial? I did it because this is some preliminary data that happened at UC Davis. This is Steve Kapka, our statewide specialist. He's done a lot of work on safflower. He's about 6 feet tall, and this is some safflower that he grew over the winter. They did irrigate it, and so and they had a huge, very, very robust stand, outcompeted weeds. And this trial is actually looking at cover crops for mitigating soil compaction. The weeds data that I collected is just to kind of try to collect robust agronomic data that's of interest to growers with cover cropping. But we're actually looking at the effect of soil compaction, and safflower is unknown as a soil breaker. So I thought that if it could grow well in the winter, after seeing this preliminary data, that would be a great option for mitigating soil compaction. And then it gets terminated in time to plant a summer annual. These are the control plots from that. So very heavy weed pressure, all weeds and bare soil. And then when we go to the Margentinia white mustard, this was planted at just 10 pounds an acre. There were no weeds in that plot at all. Here's a picture of me. I'm 5'8". This mustard is up almost to my shoulder in some places. We had to use 2-meter sticks side by side to get our height data. So the Margentinia white mustard, despite the extremely dry conditions, really was off to the races. And even in the mixes that we planted, I noticed that the mustards and the brassicas really kind of dominated. Because they were more competitive than some of the other varieties in a low water environment. And then the last kind of data that I'll show about cover crops, project that I'll show before I talk a little bit about alfalfa is last year we couldn't have any outreach events or anything like that. So we put out these single row plots at 7 different locations in the valley so that people could come look at the varieties on their own as they were able. This is a push planter that we used, and here are 2 of my colleagues at the UC seeding these trials. So it's a little bit coarser than using a tractor where you get a lot, kind of more precise seeding depth and seeding rate, etc. But we thought it was good enough for demonstration, and there were some interesting differences between the different plots. Some mid-season observations in mid to late February. The unirrigated plots in general had poor emergence for many species. The brassicas and grasses had mixed emergence, I would say poor to good, and the legumes generally had very poor emergence. In terms of weed competition, the brassicas were generally more competitive than the grasses, and both were much more competitive than the legumes, although that didn't hold true across all of the fields, as evidenced with some of these pictures. So this is an unirrigated hairy vetch plot on the right, which is mostly volunteer wheat, but most of the grasses and brassicas at this site were volunteer wheat. That volunteer wheat was very competitive and would have made a nice cover crop probably actually on its own. In the middle is an unirrigated yellow pea field, again was mostly weeds, a lot of volunteer mustard in that field. And then on the left, this is actually an unirrigated black mustard plot that did close the canopy successfully. So it kind of depended too on the site. There was some variability between the site, but in general, the irrigated sites did a lot better. When we compare 2 of the irrigated sites, I'm sorry, that's supposed to say to 1 not irrigated, not to 2 not irrigated. The one on the far right, site 3, was not irrigated. And in these next graphs, we're gonna see the gray is the cover crop, the orange is the weeds, and the blue is the bare soil. There were 7 species in which there was no stand at all in the non-irrigated site, 5 that were clovers, and then hairy vetch and common vetch. 1 other vetch did do okay and did seem to emerge, but just collected some side-by-side data in terms of percent cover to see. Definitely observed great value in being able to irrigate a cover crop to get it to be robust. And I think, more and more I'm realizing in a dry year, if you are spending the money to plant the cover crop and you can irrigate, it's probably worth it to do so. Even one irrigation is going to go a long way towards achieving some of those benefits that you want later on down the road. And the growers that I know who have been cover cropping and doing soil health management for a long time, their fields dried out so much more rapidly after that big rain we got a few weeks ago. The other fields where I have my trials now that haven't been cover cropped as long, we're still struggling to get out there and finish planting because there's just not good drainage. So there are a lot of benefits to cover cropping that I'm not going to talk about here. Just wanted to talk about specifically weeds to keep in line with the topic of the meeting. Anyway, with regards to cereal ryegrain, we can see in the 2 irrigated sites, the gray or the percent of the cover crop is a bigger slice of the pie, if not the whole pie, as compared to site 3 that's non-irrigated. And then when we look at the biomaster peas, which are 2 legumes and yellow peas, we again see the gray, and the irrigated site is just a much bigger slice of the pie in all cases. So the irrigation did help with the different species, close the canopy. This is the same for yellow mustard. We're seeing in site 1 and site 2, the vast majority is the cover crop in both of these, and in site 3, it's not that case. So still mustards and grasses are more competitive than legumes when they have no access to water, but in terms of closing canopy for weed control, there was a little bit of a mixed result depending on irrigation or not. So those last few slides, I'm actually finalizing now into a project summary from last year, and I'll be releasing that in my newsletter soon. So please email me or subscribe to my newsletter if you're interested. You can visit my newsletter and my website at a later date. However, this summary is already on our newsletter. This is Amber Ball, Veg Crop Advisor in my area, who worked with me on this cover crop performance, and we put together just a summary of we have, I believe, 18 varieties of cover crops and kind of how they did, pictures of the roots, the heights, pounds of C, and pounds of N. So some final considerations for cover crop management. Water, how much water do you have? Unfortunately, we can't predict necessarily how much water we're going to get before the end of the year when we make the decision to plant our cover crop, but that is a pretty important component. It seems more and more towards a robust stand. And then other benefits that you're trying to achieve. Are you trying to fix nitrogen? Legumes aren't very competitive with weeds. Sometimes, with irrigation, actually, sometimes they're very competitive, as we saw with that early data with the vetch. But in a dry year, they may not be as competitive, but they're fixing a lot of nitrogen. And so that benefit might be worth the risk that the stand is not going to do as well. So really weighing what those other benefits are in terms of how it grows, termination, what equipment you have. Mustards are great for outcompeting weeds, but they do make kind of a viney stem. And so it can be challenging to terminate them sometimes. And so, you can achieve some of the benefits of cover cropping with a lot of different varieties, and just really thinking about what you're trying to accomplish in your field, I think, is the best choice. Other challenges, I just wanted to quickly mention that, like going to seed, picking something that's not going to go to seed really that early. And then I put a picture here of, there's actually on my YouTube channel, we have a walkthrough of one of the irrigated variety trial sites that is, we look at all the different plots and you can see how they perform. It's only about 13 minutes, but it's pretty interesting. If you want to do cover cropping, you can see kind of how the weeds do themselves. But these forage turnips, I was really impressed with last year because they closed canopy like the other brassicas, but they stayed a little lower to the ground and they hadn't set up a seed head as early as the rest. And so that risk of increasing the brassica seeds in your soil was lower with the turnip. And that was kind of what we saw at several sites, actually, that the turnip didn't set up a seed head as early. So really thinking through those opportunities. What weeds are you controlling? Again, remembering that you're controlling the weeds that are competitive at that season that the cover crop is in the ground. Volunteer small grains can be a great cover crop if they establish well. And some additional management may increase your success. I wanted to mention the concept of mowing to reduce new seeds with regards to brassicas, something I've encouraged certain growers to do when they have a mixed stands of cover crops, or they can't get in there to really terminate. They can get a high mower in there. You can just cut off that flower stalk before it introduces new seeds into the seed bed, and then you avoid that risk because once brassica seeds are so small, once they set that seed, they blow everywhere. So mowing might be helpful in that case, and you can just, again, mow off that that top of the flower, and then control what you can. We're doing our best. These pictures on the top are of sun hemp and buckwheat. These were grown in the summer, planted in July, following a wheat harvest. Another grower told me this year that they were gonna plant on their drip line. They had to flush water through the drip line to check for leaks. So they were like, I'm gonna seed a summer cover crop there. If you have some water available mid to late summer, you can get a great stand with very little water. That'll build a ton of biomass, a lot of beneficials for the bees, as evidenced in this buckwheat. So there are good opportunities, but you just need a little bit of water. So in this case, in this picture, they irrigated it through furrow irrigation twice, and they got like, I mean, man, at the end, it must have been about 4 feet tall. Okay, so to quickly talk about this alfalfa data before I close, just to share this since we're all together here, I did some work evaluating the efficacy of pre-plant weed control in alfalfa using mechanical control or glyphosate spray. This is a little similar to what Conrad did in terms of the concept of a sterile seed bed. In this case, we did either no pre-plant treatment, tillage or glyphosate, and then either in season with none or Raptor applied, or a combination of both. And so broadleaf weeds really did dominate at first cutting. Here on this upper left graph, we're seeing percent broadleaf weeds as compared to the treatment. The orange is the no in-season control, and the blue is with the Raptor. So we can see that when we're comparing the two alongside each other, the glyphosate pre-plant with and without the in-season control, really that Raptor brought the broadleaf weeds down really a lot in tillage and the glyphosate pre-plant. And then we look at the percent cover at first cutting, and it's basically the opposite, where we have, of course, less weeds, we have more alfalfa. However, when I first was looking at this, so these are some pictures from that. So this picture is glyphosate pre-plant plus in-season Raptor, a really nice alfalfa stand. This kind of gray back here is a no weed control at all, not in-season, not pre-plant. And then this picture in the bottom right is glyphosate pre-plant, but no in-season herbicide. Man, these weeds were taller than me. I was like, you could hide a body in here. Like, it was a lot of weeds, and I was pretty bummed that the pre-plant treatments hadn't worked as well as we were thinking they were. But then after first cutting, we did stand counts, and actually there was a lot of alfalfa left in the understory of those plots. Even though there were so many weeds, there was still actually a pretty robust alfalfa stand in the understory, which I thought was great. So when we look at here, number of alfalfa plants in a 20 by 20 centimeter quadrant, after a couple weeks of regrowth, we went back out here. This is the picture on the upper left. And we're seeing no in-season control versus Raptor in season. For the glyphosate pre-plant and tillage pre-plant, there definitely is more, we do have an increase in stand with the in-season control paired with the pre-plant, but there were still a lot of alfalfa left when there was only pre-plant and no in-season application. And so I thought that was great. If you in-season applications can be very expensive, and the opportunities are limited. And then when we go down to yields, the yields were kind of in line with what we expected based on the percent cover. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just summarize this quickly by saying that pre-plant weed control in alfalfa is critical for stand establishment, more important than in-season control. If you visualize those two bars on the left in those first graphs, there was like no alfalfa left in places that had no pre-plant control, even when an in-season herbicide was sprayed. The highest yields and counts were when both pre-plant and in-season control were done at the same time, but the stand counts with pre-plant control but no in-season herbicide were still relatively high, which is great news if there are limited options for in-season control, for example, in organic growers, or when those in-season chemicals are cost prohibitive. It may be possible to do a pre-plant tillage or glyphosate spray or some kind of a pre-plant weed control to establish a good stand. You might lose some yield at the first cutting and some quality at first cutting because you have a lot of weeds in there, but you might not have that impact carryover for subsequent cuttings because there's still good stand counts in the understory. My email is here. My name is Sarah Light. I'm actually the chair of the Southwest Committee of the Western Cover Crop Council, and we're organizing a tour, a day-long drive-by tour for growers in the Sacramento Valley in early March. So please email me if you're interested. We're going to start registration for that soon. But we are prioritizing spots for growers and people who advise growers, less for researchers. Thank you.